Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Marla Orenstein. Thank you so much for joining today. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and thank you for coming to this symposium. So I'm past president of IAIA. I am also the president-elect of IAIA, but in my day job, I work for a public policy think tank, the Canada West Foundation, where I'm the director of the Natural Resources Centre. But for about 12 years before I had this job, I ran a small consulting company where we focused on health impact assessment services. And today we're going to talk about the social side of preparing for climate change. Okay. I want to start this presentation by talking about the sinking of the Titanic. This may seem like an odd choice for a talk on climate change, but please bear with me. Especially since the slide doesn't want to change. There we go. The Titanic sank on April 15, 1912. 1,517 people died in this disaster, representing 68% of the people on board. Now let's talk about who died and who survived. As you can see, there's a marked difference in the rate of people who died by the class they were traveling in. Among the first-class passengers, who were the richest and probably considered the most important, 39% of these first-class passengers died. This increases to 58% of second-class passengers and 76% of third-class passengers. There was also a death rate of 76% among the crew. And if you're wondering why this isn't even higher, it appears to be because a number of the crew were needed to man the lifeboats. Now let's look by age and sex. We can see that 84% of the male passengers died, but only 25% of women died. And as we know from the fictional movie, Rose Lives and Jack Dies. Among children, 50% died. So what's my point, and why am I telling you this? The reason is that it's a very clear example of how in a disaster in which there was uniform exposure to risk, that is, everybody was involved in the sinking, survival was socially mediated. The figures that we just saw, in which more first-class people survived than second or third class, and where more women survived than men, had to do with the preferential distribution of limited resources to specific groups. Now, I hope you see where I'm going with this. Let's move to Chicago in 1995, the era of mom jeans and fanny packs or bum bags. In July, the city of Chicago, along with some other parts of the Midwest United States, experienced a heat wave for just over a week. You can see the red lines, which show the daily high temperature were between 30 and 40 degrees Celsius. That's between 86 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And just as important is the blue line, which shows the nighttime low temperatures. Part of the problem was that temperatures didn't drop very much and were still very hot at night. The heat wave resulted in 739 deaths in the city. These were excess deaths. In other words, it isn't just that people who would have died anyhow were all dying in this period instead of dying a week or a month or 3 months later. If that had happened, there would have been fewer deaths than expected in the weeks and months afterwards, since those people would essentially have had their deaths moved up by the heat wave. But that isn't what happened. These were excess deaths that were really caused by and specific to the heat wave. Chicago is a place where the built environment doesn't help during a heat wave. In this slide, you can see the close grid pattern of Chicago's streets with a high density of buildings and little greenery. Compare this with, for example, Savannah, Georgia, a city that is built for heat. You can see the greenery, the city fountains, lower density, the porticos and the houses providing shade and air. So this tells us that one thing that contributed to the problem was the built environment. The built environment of Chicago compounded the problem of heat, as opposed to the built environment ameliorating or lessening the problem. In addition, the city set new records for energy use, which then led to the failure of some power grids. At one point, 49,000 households had no electricity. The roads buckled, train rails warped, and because more than 3,000 fire hydrants were opened, the city lost water pressure. The built environment just was not prepared for this problem, and it led to a cascade of other problems. Now let's talk about who died. Most people who died were elderly. Why did more elderly people die? There's a number of reasons, but part of that reason is biological susceptibility. Older people had more pre-existing medical conditions, such as heart disease or problems breathing, which were exacerbated by the heat. And second, as we get older, our bodies just have a harder time regulating temperature. People over 65 don't sweat as much, which means the body can't cool down as well. And seniors store fat differently, which also affects heat regulation. So what does this mean? It means that in an extreme event like this, the adverse effects are also mediated by biological susceptibility. We need to understand whose underlying biology makes them more susceptible to adverse effects. In the case of the Chicago heat wave, it was the elderly. In a different extreme situation, it could be children or people with different medical conditions. It isn't always who you'd expect either. For example, pandemic influenza, true influenza, not COVID, tends to kill off healthy young adults, as it did in the 1918 Spanish flu, and so does meningitis outbreaks. You need to understand the biology of susceptibility, and it's going to be different for different kinds of scenarios. Now, back to Chicago one more time. It wasn't just being elderly that was a risk factor for dying. Death rates were much, much higher among men than among women, and among Black men than among white or Hispanic men. Most of the people who died were elderly, Black, and poor. Why is this? The reasons are structural and social. Among this group of people, a lot didn't have air conditioners because they couldn't afford them. Or if they could afford them, a lot of people didn't turn them on because of the expense. A lot of the people who died lived in high crime neighborhoods. They were afraid to open their doors and windows. They were afraid to go out of their houses. They were afraid to let strangers into their houses. They were afraid to leave their houses empty. Many people didn't have access to transportation, or they didn't have anywhere else to go. Many older poor people are ill or disabled and have problems leaving the house for that reason. Finally, as described by Eric Kleinenberg, who wrote about the disaster, most of the African American neighborhoods with high heat wave death rates had been abandoned by employers, stores, and residents in recent decades. The social ecology of abandonment, dispersion, and decay makes systems of social support exceedingly difficult to sustain. But here's something interesting. Although the death rates among elderly, poor African American men were very high, the death rates among elderly, poor Hispanic men were very, very low. Although the Hispanic population of Chicago is about 25% and has a high proportion of poor and sick people, they only accounted for about 2% of heat-related deaths. Why is that? Part of that is social systems. In Chicago in 1995, elderly Hispanic men tended to have a lot more family supports nearby than elderly Black men. Many of the people who died during the heat wave died alone, behind closed doors, with nobody checking on them. Older Hispanic men had social supports in the form of family or friends who did check in on them and took action to protect them. Part of this may be family culture, but another part of it is that Chicago's Hispanic population tended to live in neighborhoods with high population density, busy commercial life in the streets, and vibrant public spaces. In other words, there was much less isolation and much more social cohesion as a whole in those neighborhoods. So now we put this all together, and what does it tell us? That in a crisis or an extreme event, that susceptibility is influenced by three factors: the physical environment, biological susceptibility, and the social environment. All three factor into outcomes, and all three need to be taken account of in the planning process. Now, I want to show you a couple of charts to put this story in context. Of course, we're not just talking about heat waves, but all kinds of extreme events. This slide is from the International Disaster Database and shows the number of reported natural disasters across the globe. Some of these are affected by climate change, such as flood or extreme weather, and some presumably are not, like earthquakes or volcanic activity. But all of them are disasters that we need to respond to by protecting our cities and populations. And so they all come back to this lens on vulnerable populations. I know that one of the most striking things about this slide is the increase that we see starting around the year 2000. Some of this may be attributable to rising temperatures, but another part of it is likely to be due to the increase in global population, which is now at around 7.7 billion people, compared with around 3 billion in 1960. This means that people have moved into areas that were previously uninhabited and very often are in the direct path of flooding, or in drought areas or fire zones, or that at the very least change the land around them sufficiently that the natural protective mechanisms are eroded. This slide is also from the International Disasters Database. You can tell I really like this database. This one shows the absolute number of people who died from different types of disasters. Again, we see drought, earthquake, extreme temperature, etc., starting at the year 1900 and going forward over the next 110 years. And it includes a number of different types of extreme events here. If we look at the data this way, we can see the number of deaths from each of these categories, and it's substantial in the tens of thousands. Of course, we also know that the global population has grown enormously over the past 110 years, so it's also useful to look at a rate of deaths, and that's this one. What I think is important to remember when we hear about climate change and the potential for human suffering and death that could be associated is that for many things, the rate of death has actually been decreasing over time, not increasing. The impact of floods, of droughts, of storms was much, much worse in the past. It's just that now there's many more people to be affected. And it's also important to remember that not everyone is affected equally. This graph shows the death rate from all natural disasters combined. Like the last two tables, it shows data for the year 1900 to the present, but this makes some distinctions by the economic status of the country. So here's what I see when I look at this graph. For almost all countries, most of the time, the death rate from these natural disasters is very low. But there are sharp spikes that indicate an extreme disaster has taken place. And most of the time, the deaths from those disasters have taken place in poorer countries. This speaks to the fact that a disaster can strike anywhere, but there are differing levels of resilience when a disaster does strike. And it goes back to the theme of what I've been saying, that when a disaster takes place and it affects everyone, it doesn't impact everyone equally. So finally, let's talk about what needs to be done. In contrast to what I have said we need to understand and plan around, almost all of the planning for responding to extreme climate change events has focused on infrastructure and the capacity of institutions. Where are the floodplains? Where shall we build the levees? How strong are the building foundations? That's important, but we also need to start mapping social vulnerability as well. This graphic is from a guide put out by the government of the province of Nova Scotia, but it's also been recommended to all the Canadian municipalities by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Part of their process in helping municipalities prepare for climate change and major events does include looking at social vulnerabilities, identifying who is most likely to be impacted in different scenarios, where they're located, and how help can be gotten to them. The dark green box on the left is the different categories of social vulnerability that they consider relevant: income, age, special needs, isolated locations, etc. And you'll see that a number of the categories that they looked at are the ones that were relevant in the Chicago example: age, income, community support, for example. Personally, I don't love this model. If I were to draw up the categories of social vulnerability that I think are important, it would have some of these, like age and single-parent households, special needs, isolated locations, and income. But it would also have access to the internet, because that's an incredibly important source of information during a disaster. It would have access to transportation. It would have English-speaking ability and a few others. So I like the concept, but for me, I would modify what the categories are. It's also important to remember that social vulnerabilities that are relevant in one type of an event or disaster are not necessarily the same as what would be relevant for a different event. I've listed out here some of the events that responders could be facing. And if you think of what people might be vulnerable, it might be different for each. For flood and fire, there's a need for immediate evacuation. So people who have limited access to transportation are most at risk. This might be people who are too old to drive, too poor to own a car, single parents who have difficulty moving kids quickly, etc. For heat waves or prolonged cold spells, you want people to be safe sheltering in place. So people who have marginal housing or are homeless, people who can't afford to put on the heat or air conditioning, people whose physiology won't respond well to exposure, and people who don't have social supports to check on them. These ones are at high risk during these types of events. For bad air events, it might be people who have difficulties breathing, young children and the elderly. These are the ones who are most at risk. And in the corner, I've added terrorist attacks, nuclear disasters, and pandemic disease outbreaks. These aren't really related to climate change, but if you think about it, the same principles apply. So we need to identify who is at risk and where they are. And in fact, these are tracked in certain municipalities for exactly this reason. Here's a map on housing and transportation access, and you can see it goes street by street, which is a really useful grain of information to have. It's no good if you have it that is far too broad, and you can't make differentiation to understand where you really need to bring in the help for people. This is a similar map that is on households with no internet access. So those are really useful. My takeaway message is that when we're planning for response to extreme climatic events, we must absolutely factor in all three of these factors: physical environment, personal or biological susceptibility, and social environment, in order to understand who's going to need help, where they're located, what resources might be needed, and how to get those resources to them. And I also want to note that, again, as we have been referring to extreme climatic events, it's also a useful framework for other types of disasters, like mass evacuation events, terrorist attacks, infectious disease outbreaks, as we've seen, and sudden air quality disasters. And we need to do this at a grain that is appropriate to the problem and the response. If you're interested in this further, there's several excellent books about it. And before we finish, I'm going to start my video again. And I'm going to respond to the question that's probably on everybody's minds, which is, how does this relate to the COVID pandemic? Is this something that we've seen? And the answer is yes, absolutely. That the impacts of COVID do follow the same pattern. They have been socially mediated, whether it has to do with who is getting the disease themselves, or whether it is how well people are able to muster their resources and respond to the lockdown. In terms of getting the disease, transmission is enhanced where there's clustering of people. So very often it's breaking along culture and poverty lines, which is why we've seen huge outbreaks in places like meatpacking plants across the world, for example, where you have people who have an absolute need to go to work. Very often they're not from the area, but they are new immigrants. They need to be sending money home. They have a lot of job vulnerability, so they really have to be showing up. And they don't have any autonomy over the job conditions. They have to continue working in close quarters with one another. Those are all factors that are going to enhance disease transmission. So the risk of getting disease becomes a bit socially mediated. And then on the other side, when we're coping with the lockdown itself, the people who are, not that anybody's doing well, but the people who are able to do better are certainly those with more resources, who are able to provide a laptop to their children, have a stable internet connection, can manage to work from home because they have those types of jobs, can still put food on the table. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So I know there's lots of research coming out, and that for the most part, IAIA members are not having to deal with pandemic response planning, but it is an application of the same principles, and certainly ones that we're seeing today. Everybody's suffering. The Titanic is going down, but there's limited room on the lifeboats, and it's not being equally distributed. So that's all I have to say today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium, and good luck.